Hello and welcome back, and that's right, it's time for another SSD review. And today I'm going to talk about a brand I have never once spoken about here on the channel. That's right, most of the brands I talk about, be it to do with solid state drives or hard drives or network attached storage, generally they've cropped up on the channel before, but this is the very first time that I'm talking about Titanium Micro. Now, this is their high performance SSD, and as mentioned, they're not a brand I talk about a lot because they don't really enter the kind of consumer or even prosumer market much. A lot of their solutions, like this one you can see here on screen, just get that thumbnail. A lot of their solutions that they have on the market are ones that generally make their way into enterprise settings, or they are bundled with other devices. So they're not really a front-facing brand that you will be aware of. You have used some of their products in one shape or form, I'm sure, but their solutions are ones that aren't really as commonly known as the likes of WD, Seagate and such. However, in this gluttony of PCIe Gen 4 M2 NVMEs that we're seeing arriving on the market, their SSD is one of the best in terms of reported performance and in terms of warranty and support. Because the three available capacities that are out there, 1TB, 2TB, and indeed 4TB, they are one of the few brands out there with a 4TB drive. Their SSDs, although arriving in, frankly, incredibly understated packaging, feature support of not just hitting that 7,000 megabytes per second benchmark, but going as high as 7,200. Indeed, there aren't that many PCIe Gen 4x4 M2 NVMe SSDs on the market right now that surpass 7,000. They merely say, yeah, we can just reach the 7. And indeed, with right performance at a reported 6,850 megabytes per second on the 4TB model, that is an enormous jump there. There's even reported IOPS that exceed every other drive on the market. So it's really weird with me talking about SSDs so much in the last few weeks that so few of you have heard of this drive. And in today's video, we are going to be going through what we like about it, some of the things we don't like about it, and getting it on the test machine to do some of those tests that we've already done before. So let's have a look at the drive. As mentioned, really understated packaging. I'll be honest with you, I kind of, when I was arranging for this to come here, I kind of thought with the kind of reported benchmarks that I was seeing on this drive, I thought they'd be a bit more highfalutin in their retail packaging. Clearly, it's a far more understated way they've gone for this, because they're not thinking they're going to be front of sale on the shelf of your local IT shop. And indeed, this is genuinely the only drive I have utilised in any of my reviews, be it for PS5, for reviews or comparison benchmarks, where nowhere on the box does it mention the benchmark. Whether you look at Brent, Seagate, WD, Samsung, any of these brands, their external packaging makes a point of highlighting how fast their drive is. This drive does none of that. It's incredibly understated and just kind of simplistic. It's just, this is our drive, go to our website for information on your warranty. That's about it. Again, fair play to them. They're going to let the product speak for itself. I really hope in testing we get to see that. But let's get it out of the box. Remove the cardboard inner. Have a look there. We've got a little card there where we can register for our warranty. Definitely something we're going to talk about later on. And of course, we've got the drive itself. Now, in today's review, we are looking at the 1TB model, which is going to be very important later on when we talk about the performance benchmarks. Let's bring that closer to camera there. There is the drive. Now, again, I've not even mentioned the model ID yet, the TH7175. And this drive is part of they do have multiple series of SSDs in their range, but this is the highest performing of the bunch. Now, by performance, I've already talked about it a little bit there, but let's talk about the architecture of this drive. Yes, it is a PCIe Gen 4 SSD, and we've seen a lot of those recently, and it arrives in a 1TB model for about $250 odd, a 2TB model for about $480, $490, and a 4TB model for between $950 to $1,000, which is a lot of money, I know. But at that point, to fit 4TB on a 2280 length SSD, one of these M2s, is still pretty impressive. And the NAND utilization inside and the performance benchmarks of the 4TB slightly justify that price tag, and again brings it far more into comparison against the FireCuda 530 from Seagate there. It takes advantage of NVMe revision 1.4, so again the latest revisions there to make sure you get the most out of that drive. The NAND on board is a 96 layer 3D TLC NAND, so none of the QLC nonsense here. They've gone straight in with the top tier stuff there. On top of that, let's talk about endurance, because once again, this is going to be compared a lot versus the FireCuda, because those benchmarks, the pricing, everything's very similar, and the FireCuda, it has to be said, does have the higher endurance factor at 0.7 drive writes per day. Now, this drive does have 0.3 drive writes per day report, and of course, terabytes written across the different capacities do vary. But what's particularly interesting about this drive is it arrives with 7 years warranty. Now, a lot of you will be going, "Whoa, that sounds like a lot." You're right, it is a lot. Nearly every single brand has 5 years. There was about 3 or 4 years ago, some SSD brands were knocking around with 6, 7, or even 10 years. But for some reason, that all went away. And now SSDs, particularly NVMe SSDs, never have more than 5 years. A brand will never go further than 5 years warranty because of things like wear on the NAND there and electronic damage and degradation on the drives themselves. But Titanium Micro gives this drive 5 years of warranty, and if you register online, you get another 2 years, so a maximum 7 years warranty on this drive. Now, that is why that drive writes per day, although if you look at a terabytes written drive against drive, it looks higher than the likes of the Seagate FireCuda and the Samsung 980 Pro and the WD Black. You have to remember that terabytes written isn't as useful as drive writes per day as a consensus across the whole capacity series. And once you factor in the 7 years there, that's what brings it down to 0.3 drive writes per day rather than potentially 0.38 drive writes per day, but still very good. And that extra 2 years warranty is going to be an enormous peace of mind for a lot of buyers out there. Now, we can talk about MTBF, it's 1.6 million hours, but not a lot of people take advantage of that these days in terms of performance and longevity of a drive. But at the same time, this drive, again, does feature very impressive performance. Now, although the read performance is good, what I really want you to think about is the write performance. So the 500 gig model arrives with a potential read of 7,150 megabytes per second, already putting it ahead of the majority of the PCIe Gen 4 SSDs out there right now. But what's really interesting is that 500 gig model also arrives with 6,800 megabytes per second write. So its write performance is incredibly close to that 7,000 there, when loads of these drives of this same architecture in PCIe Gen 4 M2 NVMe very rarely break higher than about 5 to 5,500, and this is cracking out 6,800. Now, the minute you move on to the 1 TB, these raise higher to 7,175 megabytes per second sequential read, and in terms of write, another 6,800. And at the top end, you got 7,200 megabytes per second sequential read and 6,890 megabytes per second sequential write, which is huge, and you can kind of start to see why its price tag is as high as it is. Not just about capacity, but sheer throughput there, sequential data wise, in other words, big data. Now, how does that translate into IOPS? Well, IOPS on this drive is actually kind of an unusual bag, because although it's in one particular case, it has the highest IOPS of any drive I've featured and reviewed here on the channel to date, only one of them has, and the rest of it is actually lower. To put that into perspective, the 500 gig features 360,000 read IOPS and 645,000 write IOPS, and again that's 4K IOPS there. In the middle there, the 1 TB, we've got 640,000 over 630,000, but the top end, that 4 TB, is 660,000 IOPS in read, and in write 1.25 million. Now that is impressive, not only because it breaks into the millions, but because it exceeds that of the Seagate, the Samsung and the WD Black. With all of those, one of their chief pioneering selling points is they were some of the few drives out there that could break into the 1 million IOPS barrier. And this drive has managed to do it with that 4 TB and exceed over those significantly at 25% higher than those based on the reported figures. Now, let's get our top panel off here and take a little look at this drive. For those that aren't aware, this drive takes advantage of that Phison controller, the E18, a drive controller we have already talked about multiple times here on the channel in other SSDs. Let's get this label off of here. That's where you get it. We've got a grip. Let's get that out of there and take a good look at our drive. We'll get that label back on later on. And as you can see there, right at the top, there is our Phison controller there. Let's get the light just right for that one. Underneath that, we've got the memory module there. And again, that is a single 1 TB module, 1 GB module there of DDR4, 2666 megahertz memory. And of course, we've got our 4 blocks of NAND, that 96 layer 3D TLC NAND. The other side of the drive is completely blank there. Again, the larger capacities do take advantage of two-sided PCB integration, but again, lovely organization there with the Phison controllers there at the top. Both of them, even the little dinky side one there, the tiny little chip that you can see. It's a very nice, tight layout of chips. Of course, with the chips being that close together, heat is going to be a concern. Yes, the NAND, you want to keep the NAND a little bit warm. It keeps it running better, not too hot, but just warm enough. But the controller, you want to make sure that's lovely and cool. Now, they do have their own heatsink that you can purchase separately, and it is a beast. It's a fan-mounted heatsink for this. And although that is an additional price, at least they do supply one, but you will have to do the application yourself, which is a bit of a bummer, really. Normally, when you buy an SSD and heatsink from one brand using their first-party stuff, it's always nice if they apply it, because then it's done in manufacturing settings, in dust control, air control, that sort of thing. And it makes sure that any thermal pads can be more strategically placed on individual NAND components there, and of course the controller. But we can use third-party heat sinks there. We are going to be taking advantage of the ALOT M2 heatsink that we talked about and utilised in our other SSD tests. And of course, when we run our test shortly, we will be taking a good look at crystal disk throughout to make sure that we're getting some of the temperature readings and a chart dictating just how hot this drive runs. Because that kind of performance benchmark there, even at the 1 TB threshold, it's going to generate a lot of heat, and those chips are actually quite close together. But I've talked about this for long enough. Let's get this drive inside our test machine and run a bunch of tests on this to see how well it performs. Okay, so here we are on the desktop of my test machine. Now, for those that haven't followed my other videos, this is utilising an 11th gen i5 6-core processor, also arriving with 16 gig of DDR4 memory. We're utilising Windows 10 Pro. We're using embedded graphics. We don't have an external graphics card or PCIe upgrade or anything like that, so we'll be using just system resources. The result will be, but don't be surprised that there might be a slight cap on some of the performance. A lot of the time when you see a lot of the benchmarks online, they will be taking advantage of Xeon processors, 8 to 12 cores. I haven't got that here, so it's worth bearing that in mind. Crystal Disk has recognised the drive straight away. There is our 1 terabyte drive there, and we are taking advantage of PCIe Gen 4x4, and that is NVMe 1.4 standard. Now, again, I've not done much with this drive yet. The testing has by no means started. But the temperature is pretty cool. A lot of these drives, even in idle, when I first installed them, will generally sit around 28, 29 C before we run any of our tests. Obviously, that will spike up throughout the testing, but again, lovely, cool, low temp start for that drive. Something we will keep an eye on later on. Now, we are taking advantage of OBS screen recording today, which unfortunately means it will impact some of the performance benchmarks. So the one I'm going to do is just give you some idea. I'm going to open up AJA for our first test, just to show you that when we do utilise the the screen recording software, it does cap a lot of this stuff. So what I'm going to be doing is just demonstrating that there. So as you can see, this drive isn't giving us anywhere near what it should be giving us right now. A lot of the time that is because of the benchmarking, the OBS screen recording software. As you can see there, the through line on the average there in the top is just not able to do it because of this software. We can look at that. We can see that the temperature is raised up to 30 almost immediately if we refresh that there because of that testing. So it's worth bearing that in mind. That is why all of these tests are going to be conducted, and I'm going to bring you guys back. I'm going to test for about 20-25 minutes, and I'm going to leave 1 minute of cooldown time between every test for the sake of fairness. And throughout our test, we will be running the following. We're going to be running 3 ATO disk benchmark tests at 256 megabyte, 1 gigabyte and 4 gigabytes. We are then also going to be running Crystal Disk. And Crystal Disk, ignore the black screen you keep seeing there. That's just me opening up the applications each time. Don't worry, there's nothing wrong there. And again, each one of these tests, I'm going to be, in the case of Crystal Disk, taking advantage of a 1, a 4 and a 16 gig test file while we're doing this. And then after that, we're going to be running a SSD. And with this, we're going to be running a 1, a 3 and a 5 gigabyte test file there inside. Ending finally at the end with AJA on a 1, a 4 and a 16 gig test file where we look at the capture and playback of AJA. So we've got lots of tests planned. I've already mapped the drive, as you can see, as the T drive inside this system. If we bring that back there, we can see that the drive has been added as a T. So again, that is the drive for all of our testing. And without further ado, I'm going to conduct these tests and bring you guys back after they've all been completed. Right, so we've completed all of our tests, and straight away, first thing I want to highlight is something I did mention earlier on in the beginning of this video about temperature. Now, this SSD we are using in that Elatang heatsink is like 10 quid or something like that. And this SSD throughout all of the testing was actually pretty good, it has to be said, all the way through. The highest it ever got to was 50C, which again, when you look at the sheer volume of tests that we have performed throughout this video, you'll see why that is such an impressive temperature control for such a high performance drive. Now, I think it's important that we remind ourselves of the benchmarks of this drive as provided by Titanium Micro themselves. There is our drive, the TH7175. And if we have a look at the benchmarks there, we can scroll on down, and there is the reported drive performance. Now bear in mind, we are looking at the left hand side of the screen here, and we are looking at the 1TB model. Unfortunately, I've got to say, I didn't crack 7,000 megabytes per second on this SSD. Now, I do think a little bit of that was the performance of my own hardware here. So again, we're going to let it off in some ways, but we're going to go into a little bit more detail throughout. But we're going to keep that there on screen for the basis of comparison. We're going to remove the temperature sensor, we're going to remove that, and just go straight into our report. So first and foremost, let's go with Crystal Disk. So again, we performed 3 tests on Crystal Disk. We went for a 1 gigabyte file, a 4 gigabyte test file, and a 16 gigabyte test file. And we got 4 or less than 4 megabytes under 7,000 there. Bear in mind, their highest sequential read they reported on this was 7,150, and that was on a 12-core Ryzen powered, Xeon I should say, Xeon powered CPU inside there. And again, write performance consistently on sequential write was over 5,600 comfortably in every single test. Indeed, by around 62 megabytes per second there, so well exceeding the 5,600 reported sequential write by Titanium Micro themselves on this performance. We did some mixed testing as well for a little bit of real world, but ultimately I'm quite happy with those, and I'm prepared to accept that it was my system that was perhaps causing some of the limitations there on that 6,900 and not the fault of the SSD, because it responded remarkably well and with the temperatures comfortably controlled. So if we come out of the Crystal Disk benchmarks there, we can go into ATO, and with ATO we did a 256 megabyte, a 1 gigabyte and a 4 gigabyte test file there. So again, these are going a little bit stricter there. We're going into some of these different block types here, and we can see that read Let's go back to the megabytes per second. In terms of read, we were hitting 6,500 comfortably and easily within Atto 6,500, somewhere there at the early 256 KB mark across all three. And if we go into the IOPS, obviously these are indicative of the IOPS of these larger file types, but still nonetheless comfortable, good numbers there throughout on the Titanium Micro there. Not really anything to critique, if I'm perfectly honest. These are kind of what I expected based on these specifications all the way through. If we go from there and make our way into AS SSD, wrong one there, it should be highlighted that AS SSD always a bit more aggressive in its numbers there. Generally, you'll always find it 1,000 to 1,200 less than the recommended minimums. Recommended maximums of official pages there. And again, lovely numbers there as a basis of comparison. Let's bring up some performance of a similar SSD. So let's go for the Sabrent. Let's go for that one there. Actually, indeed, not the Sabrent. Let's go for the Corsair, which I think is a decent little comparison there. This is a Corsair 1 TB drive that we had. As you can see, even when we utilise this in Crystal Disk, it was able to get very, very close, but again, not surpass that 7,000 there. If we compare it against the AS SSD marks that we're looking at here, we can see that this drive was a little under on read, but a little higher on write. And if we go into the same goes for that of the 3 GB test file, it did exceed it here in both there on the Titanium Micro drive. And finally, we can have a look at the 5 GB file there, compare them, and again, the get the name right there, sorry about that, the micro drive there, Titanium Micro, most certainly did win the day there overall, compared with a very similar architecture drive, a Phison E18 drive there, managed to get that extra bit out of it. So finally, we can look at AJA, and on the AJA benchmarks there, let's bring those up. And again, the main focus here needs to be at the bottom, not the top numbers, because of sustained memory consumption throughout this. So on the left, we've got a 1 GB test file, and we have a 4 GB test file. If we stack these a little bit there, let's stack them up, pop that there, pop that on top, and bring the last one in, bring the 16 in. We can see, based on these stats there at the bottom, that again, the read and the writes there were still comfortably in the respective 4 and 5,000s. And again, we did see a drop, as you can see there on the 16 gig file there, as the memory or the the SD RAM got completely saturated there. But again, comfortably supported numbers there, and the drive, with the exception of that dropping there of the memory, I think these are pretty good numbers for this SSD, although we haven't seen the SSD break into those reported 7,000s. I would say that the IOPS live up to it, and certainly the write performance lives up to exactly what we wanted to see there. And again, bearing in mind this drive is one that's got a comfortably large warranty included with it, and particularly when it's a brand that isn't as well known as many of the others that we've talked about before, I'm quite impressed with the numbers we've seen. And once again, the thing that stood out for me, which is an odd one of course, is simply that temperature rise was nowhere near as high as I've seen from other SSDs with incredibly similar Phison E18 and architecture with 96 layer NAND. Indeed, there are a few little bibs and bobs and extras inclusive of this drive that aren't available in other drives, such as some of that secure erase support and stuff like that. And, of course, with the drive having that extra warranty, there's a little bit more peace of mind there to be found than a number of its contemporaries. Now, we are going to be doing a little bit more testing on this inside a PS5 system. We're also going to be revisiting some of these SSDs for game loading and just seeing how well they load into PC gaming worlds on an upgraded PC rig, where we are going to be having a lot more graphical enabled processes and rerunning some of these tests on another system. But ultimately, I do recommend the Titanium Micro drive, even if it's a lesser known drive. I think there's a lot to be said for it, and there's definitely, when it comes to particularly the 4 TB model, some real standout performance benchmarks and reliable features available immediately on this drive that are just not present anywhere else. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, click like. It helps me understand what you guys like in these videos and what you don't. If you want to learn more, click subscribe. We've got lots more SSD reviews to do, along with NAS, DAS, Thunderbolt, and more every single day. And of course, take advantage of the free advice section over on NASCompares. It's linked to in the description. It's manned by two people, me and Eddie the web guy, a completely free data storage advice service. We don't do anything with your email. You don't have to pay a penny. There's donate buttons, but you could ignore them if you like. And ultimately, we're there to help you. Just, it might take us a day or two to answer because we are humans with lives. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.